Okay, so this is the last system going under the third exam. I'm sorry for saying the endocrine system was the last. I looked at my notes from other years and decided get the digestive system on there. Hope I put up enough amendments for people to realize. Interesting, interesting. I'd say we taste a little like chicken. So the thing about foods is that there's not a lot of good generic descriptors for foods beyond sweet and salty and such. We mostly compare them to how other things taste. It's a long tube. So your digestive system is in the job of getting things into you that you need to run your chemistry. So a lot of this is the breakdown of organic molecules that we talked about way back when. So carbohydrates broken down into sugars, lipids broken down into components that can be reassembled in cell membranes and fat and other kinds of molecules. Proteins broken down into amino acids. And nucleic acids are parts of everything else, so it doesn't need to be specifically addressed. On top of that, you have little molecules that are useful in a lot of our chemistry. They're called coenzymes. And we use them for a whole bunch of different things. Now, the way that evolution has worked is that if there are coenzymes, since they're little molecules, we can just pull them out of our food and absorb them. And if they're in our food and have been for a very, very long time, then we don't make them. Is that we used to make them. Some animals make them. These are coenzymes is the broad category. The ones that we need to get from our food are called vitamins. If you think about a cat, there's a bunch of vitamins that we get because we are plant eaters. Cats are not plant eaters. So cats do not have a source in their food of vitamin C, for instance. Well, cats construct vitamin C. They have a gene that makes an enzyme that makes vitamin C. So the term vitamin is actually very human-centric. Vitamins are technically coenzymes that people don't make or can't make that we get from our food. And because we're omnivores, we eat a very broad category of different animals and plants. We've got a pretty long list of things that are vitamins, things that we get from plant-based materials and things we get from animal-based materials. Whereas something that eats just plants might have to construct a lot of B vitamins that are, you get some of them from plants, but also a certain number of B vitamins you tend to get from meat products. And of course, then there's minerals, right? We talked about iodine in thyroid hormone, iron in hemoglobin, the sodium, and there's a whole bunch of different minerals that we need for our chemistry that we get from our food. And really all the digestive system does with minerals is get someplace where you can absorb them into your blood, because they don't really need to be broken down to any large extent. Now, minerals come in different categories. There are major, minor, and trace minerals. Major minerals are things that we kind of need all the time. Trying to think of one that's, I can't think of one. Potassium. Minor minerals we don't use a lot is that we need them occasionally. A lot of times we recycle them so that we don't need a huge amount of them because they haven't been that available in our diets. And trace minerals are things that we barely need. They used to think that iron was a major mineral. Now it's kind of basically, because we recycle it so well, it's more or less a trace mineral. You don't need huge amounts of iron in your diet. You don't need a lot of iodine in your diet because we do recycle it. We only use it for the one thing. And then there's weird things like selenium, which has a very, they didn't even know selenium was a necessary mineral until just a few years ago. I think it's integrated into like one enzyme. There's a concept called assimilation. Just because it's in your food doesn't necessarily mean that it winds up in you. Is that there's a lot of stuff we can't assimilate. Plant fibers just go in one end and out the other because we can't break them down. But on any given day, there may be parts of your food that you normally would absorb that for one reason or another you don't. Assimilation is taking it in and using it. And part of this goes toward calories. Calories are a measurement of energy. It's the energy in your food, but it's really the energy in the food you actually absorb and use. So if, say, you're sick and you're crampy and diuretic, you're not assimilating a lot of stuff. If you've got giardia, giardia interferes with your ability to absorb things, so your assimilation goes down. Some people take laxatives. Laxatives don't, we'll talk about this, they don't really move stuff particularly through the absorptive part of your digestive system. So they don't cut down on your assimilation to any huge extent. Just kind of unpleasant. So it's a tube. That's what the system is. It actually grows out from your umbilical cord. Actually grows out your umbilical cord. Your intestines do. Long loop that you gradually pull into your body and kind of stuff in here. But a branch grows up toward the top. The chickens that we looked at in the lab don't actually have a mouth yet because that part of the digestive system hasn't made contact with the surface. And the other end as well. Does the same thing. And there are organs that are connected to your digestive system that are critical for your digestion, but food doesn't go through them. Those are accessory organs. Your salivary glands are accessory organs. Your pancreas is an accessory organ. Your liver is an accessory organ. It's necessary, but food never goes through your liver. Food doesn't go through your salivary glands. Food doesn't go through your pancreas until it's been absorbed. But that's not the same thing. The food is pushed along like getting toothpaste out of a toothpaste tube, a traveling contraction of muscles. That's peristalsis. You can feel it when you swallow. Now that's conscious control peristalsis. At the front end and the back end, you control the squeeze. But once it gets down to about here, it goes on automatic. And it goes, when your stomach also churns, so the peristalsis at the end is kind of periodic. Once the food is in your intestines, the squeeze goes along about every 5 minutes or so. If you got air in there, you can kind of hear it. And when it gets into your colon, which has a bigger bore, it holds more cross-sectionally, then you push it along a little bit more slowly, about every 10 to 15 minutes. We're going to start at the top. Your receiving chamber, technically called the buccal cavity, not buckle for belt buckle, but buckle because that means cheeks. And in there, we've got a few things. When I took zoology, I was kind of surprised to discover that when you compare us to other backboned animals, one of the things that makes our furry group, the mammals, different is that in each one of our mouths, we have a range of different types of teeth. Is that reptiles their teeth may vary in size, but they tend to be similar in shape and purpose. So a bunch of pointy teeth or a bunch of grindy teeth. Whereas we have pointy and choppy and grindy teeth all in the same mouth. We've got incisors in the front that overlap like scissors on the ones on the bottom. Those are choppy teeth. We've got canines on the side. Those are pointy. Those are good for tearing and ripping on things. That's why, big-time carnivores have canines as a combination of gripping. They latch on to things and squeeze the throat in order to kill animals, but also for ripping at meat when they're eating meat. And then in the back, we have grinding teeth. That gives us more flexibility. Our ancestors were plant eaters, and we are omnivores. You see more of that kind of separation into different types of food choices in mammals than you do in, say, reptiles. It's unusual for a group of reptiles that are carnivores to have herbivores inside that group, because it takes a big shift in tooth structure. We're also weird, and nobody can explain this, and then we tend to go through our lifetimes with just 2 sets of teeth, where we start out with what we tend to call baby teeth, and then we get our adult teeth. And sometimes we have more teeth as adults than we do as babies. That's our wisdom teeth. It's true for other animals as well, some other mammals as well. But why don't we just keep replacing teeth? We could. I've had 4 there, so I know it's possible to. It's not even in place. It grows out of the top of my jaw and comes down and pushes the old one out. But I've had 4, maybe 5 of them there. So there isn't any magical restriction against it, except there is a restriction against it. We only generate 2 sets of teeth, typically. Who knows? Your teeth are rooted in your jaws, but it would be very nice if it wasn't easy for bacteria that live in your mouth to get down at the bone of your jaws. So your teeth are encased at the base in gums, tissue that surrounds them. And yeah, it's not a perfect seal. Things do get down in there, and the bacteria start working, and they produce acids that wear through the enamel and eventually through the calcium and produce cavities. If they get down really deep and get into, if you have gum problems, then you've got much more major issues. People with major tooth problems usually have gum issues. There was a paper out last year that suggested that bacteria associated with gum problems might be, under some conditions, getting deeper into the head. It might be somehow helping to generate Alzheimer's disease. I haven't heard anything about it since. So maybe people are doing follow-ups and are going to find out that that's actually a real thing, or they're going to follow up and find out it doesn't really work the way that somebody thinks it does. But you may at some point in the future hear people talking about trying to make sure that your teeth are nice and clean and make sure your gums are in good shape so that you don't get Alzheimer's disease. Another thing I was surprised when I took zoology, we tend to think of saliva as being digestive, and it barely is. It doesn't really break much of anything down. Its primary purpose is to take all those little bits and pieces of food we get from grinding it up and sticking it together in a ball that our throats can catch and swallow. So it's temporary glue. And yeah, we throw a couple of digestive enzymes in there for things that we can digest without digesting our own mouths. If you've read the lab, you know that that's important. But the primary purpose of saliva is to give us a grippable ball of food to swallow. If you ever tried to swallow a really tiny pill, there's a reason we take them with water, because our throats can't grab them and our esophagus can't swallow them. And in your mouth, you have your tongue. It is a manipulator. It pushes food around so that you can chew it up effectively. Don't think about this while you're doing it, or you will bite your tongue. But what it does is very complex, is that while you're chewing and not even thinking about it, it's moving and turning and pulling out so that it doesn't get bitten on. That's what happens when you start paying attention to it. It slows down and you tend to bite it. You also have your sense of taste on your tongue, which we'll talk about more when we get to the senses, last chapter. And it's a ramrod, is that once you've got all of your food chewed up and stuck together with saliva, you toss it onto the back of your tongue, and the back of your tongue is higher in the back. It pushes the food into your pharynx, your throat that you share with your breathing system, because the nose and the windpipe both connect to that. And that's going to be the next thing on the list. There was an article out just last week that somebody thinks they've discovered a salivary gland that nobody's ever noticed before. You see that every once in a while. It's supposed to be somewhere in here, I guess. All depends on how many samples they looked at. People are weird. We're all, almost every one of us is built weird in some way. So if they just looked at a couple of examples, they may have found, salivary glands growing in places that they're not normally supposed to be. So this is the pharynx, this is the tongue. Toss it back there, that kind of pulled the tongue up so that you can see the little connector for the tongue. Salivary glands off to the side. You've got salivary glands here, here, and under the base of your tongue. So here's the tongue. Pushes stuff back into your pharynx. That little thing that hangs down in the back snaps up and closes off this entrance to your nasal cavity. Is that little teardrop? That's about the shape of the opening between your nasal cavity and the back of your throat, your pharynx. And when you swallow, it snaps up into that. And of course, if you're drinking liquid and you make it shake, right, as a kid, you always try to get people to laugh and get milk to come out their nose. Is that air coming up and the shaking can actually push liquids up, and then it goes up the wrong way into your nose. This is your larynx, your basically your breathing system. There is a flap that covers that up as well. So your pharynx, which people tend to misspell, they spell it pharynx instead of pharynx. And those two structures are the uvula, the one at the top, and the epiglottis, the one over the entrance to your voice box, your larynx. And they make sure the food's supposed to go the same way, down the right way. Of course, if you're trying to breathe at the same time you're trying to swallow, then things can go, the epiglottis has to open for you to breathe. That's why they tell you not to talk with your mouth full, because if you're trying to talk around your food, it's much easier to inhale your food, because that thing has to get open in order for you to talk. Once you're clear of the pharynx, you're into the epiglottis, or no, I'm sorry, the esophagus. So the esophagus. Now, you guys have done the pig, you know that your diaphragm is there. And the esophagus has to go through the diaphragm to attach to the stomach. It actually swings a little bit more to the left than this usually. And at the top of the stomach is a valve. Your stomach's full of acid. You would like it to not go up into your esophagus. Your stomach is coated with mucus to protect you from the acid. Your esophagus is not coated with mucus. If acid gets up in there, it will burn the lining. That's what heartburn is. See, it goes right behind your heart. So if you get that pain, it's pretty much localized at your heart. So you feel like something's wrong with your heart. This gap in the diaphragm is called the hiatus. And with certain types of damage, parts of the stomach can actually stick out through that gap. And that compromises the valve, and it's called a hiatal hernia. And you get much more acid reflux and acid damage at the bottom of the esophagus from that. You can actually burn holes right through the esophagus and bleed. You do some pretty nasty stuff with a hiatal hernia. Incidentally, if you bring stuff back up, that's reverse peristalsis. It's the same squeeze, just going the other way. Not all animals can do that. Since we're omnivores, we have a history of going, oh, I wonder if this is good to eat, and finding out pretty quickly, oh, that was not good to eat. Back up it comes. Animals that eat the same thing all the time, like grass, not typically going to run into something that they need to bring back up, so they may not be able to do that. But here's your stomach. Here's the esophagus coming down. There'd be a valve there. There'd be a valve there. Is that the valve prevents reflux of acid back up into there. But of course, once you've mixed your food with the acid, you got to let it out. This controls the outflow so that you're not throwing too much at a time at your intestines, which need to neutralize the acid in order to do their job. So you've got your stomach. Your digestive tube has 2 layers of muscles for the squeeze, for peristalsis. Your stomach has a 3rd set of muscles because it churns. It takes your food and it mixes it up with acid, not bile. Organic molecules are big, and they often have particular shapes that make them very difficult to get at and pull apart unless you can get them to unwind. Acid interferes with the little hydrogen bonds that are holding these big molecules, especially proteins, together. And they unwind so that you can then start snipping the amino acids apart. The bad thing about that is that some proteins, once they're out of your stomach acid and into your intestine, they'll go zoop, and they'll go back into the shape they started as and be still difficult to digest. In your stomach, you have one active enzyme, and it can snip a particular joint between 2 amino acids. So this is what happens. Gets into your stomach acid, it unwinds the proteins, and this enzyme goes snip, 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 snip. So what comes out are still long chains of amino acids, but the protein is no longer intact. It can't reform because it's been snipped into pretty big bits. But you only need to snip it into pretty big bits. Now it's just strings, and your other enzymes in your intestine can go, there's an enzyme for this linkage and an enzyme for that linkage and an enzyme for that linkage. All the different ways amino acids connect to one another. You have particular enzymes for that. That's in your intestine, though. Your stomach is protected from the acid by a layer of mucus. That layer can get compromised, and the acid can work its way through and start burning the lining of your stomach, can actually burn a hole through your stomach. You wind up with a perforated ulcer. Ulcers usually are just damage to the lining, and there's a type of bacterium that contributes to that. When the guy first, you got a handout about this, actually written by the guy who discovered this, and he ran into the problem of people going, these things can't live in acid. Bacteria can't live in acid. And he went, yes, it can. Look, I gave myself some of them and gave me an ulcer. Okay, we're going to stop there before we hit the small intestine, because this is getting long.